And welcome back to the COVID Reboot series brought to you by the Cape Town Fashion Council. I'm your host, Colin Donsker. On this episode, we discuss simple ways to manage your cash flow. We've got the CEO of C8CA, Royston Benjamin, as our guest and expert on the show today. Royston, good afternoon and welcome.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Royston. The big question for SME business owners currently facing a crisis or challenges in their businesses, what are three things that SME owners must do today to keep their cash flowing?
So, Colin, it's a very difficult time we're going through. I think the times are not necessarily the normal. So there's added pressure on SME to innovate and recreate their current businesses and their business models. So if I look at clients that we've dealt with, one key area would be just looking at the USP of the business. So what the unique selling point of why you have started that business and your customer offering, and looking at and seeing, is it still relevant in the current times? Markets have shifted now. And habits have shifted now. A lot of businesses prior to the pandemic were either growing or were dying, and COVID obviously was just the fast of that. So you've got to look at your USP and see, is it still relevant in this existing market? That's for me number one. I would say then, if your USP is relevant and you still have a client base and clients are still happy with your product and service, you need to improve service levels. That's critical now. Clients are very much in demand of whatever product or service they are looking for, and they want the best quality service for that price. Yeah. So if you have a product the market wants, but your service levels are not in line with them, it means clients will not come to you and they will eventually leave you, ultimately affect your cash flow. Then number three, is just cash flow and budgeting. That's quite a key of a business. So many businesses they think their business is sustainable because they're paying them, but they don't actually do the budgeting and the management process correctly. So even though there is cash flow, they manage correctly. So those are like your top three areas, I would say, that are most relevant now in businesses.
Absolutely. You mentioned budgeting as your third point. I think often we focus on budgeting, but we do very little focus on forecasting. So let's talk briefly about why cash flow forecasting should be a standard practice for every SME.
It's so relevant today because you need to know what your inputs are versus your outputs.
Yeah.
Your inputs have been severely affected now in terms of clients' payments and their price and their fees they would like to pay. But your outputs have relatively stayed the same. You need to pay rentals, you need to pay salaries. All of those stuff generally have not necessarily significantly gone down. So to monitor that, you need to actually put in practical steps, and about it a bit later, but like a daily cash flow, looking at what your inputs, outputs are, looking at that consistently with the monthly budget, and comparing that to the annual budget, actual versus budgets. So you actually have to implement this on a very operational level, on a day-to-day basis, so you can get your goals towards year end.
Absolutely, yeah. We've been on the episode, on the series, we've been discussing, every single aspect of your business. So from your marketing to your public relations, to your digital strategy, production, etc., etc. But when it comes to your finances, how do businesses, or what restructuring should they be doing at this point to prepare business for the changing or the changed market?
So, what we typically would do in our business, and I think it's relevant for all businesses, is look at the market leader, and this is purely from the USP type of point of view. Look at your market leader and look at what changes they are doing to their products and services, and by that way you can judge whether your business is still remaining relevant in the market. Market leaders change and come as they go, but if you're following the market leader, you generally are within line, and generally your product is accepted in the general market. from a finance point of view, principles that never change, whether you're a small business or quite a large corporate. So I always tell small businesses, even though these might be limited for a startup, always have the culture and the mindset that you are a larger corporate. You might just be the one person in operations, sales, everything, finance, but try to implement processes as you were a big corporate. That habit of 21 days will be implemented quite easily when you get more staff and you do get a finance manager and a marketing manager, etc.
Now, Royston, we live in a day where they say content is king, but we all know that cash is king, because without cash, we can do very little for our businesses. What are some of the easiest ways to, at this point, access cash and get your business investor ready?
Yeah. So, I mean, it all depends on the level of investment needed. So, obviously, for early startups, the easiest way to obtain cash would be the 3 F's, the friends, families, and fools. So quite easily, if your product is quite simple, and it's always good to actually use those, because you actually have a soundboard in terms of how good your product is sometimes. And people, if they're willing to invest at that early stage, it means that you do have, that could become a long-term business in the future, So I would say that is probably the most easiest access to some sort of cash. On from there, like the banks and financial institutions, it's a lot difficult to get finance or sort of cash flow from them. They're mainly looking at security and affordability, which might not be applicable for the startup, but might be applicable for the business growing in maybe a 3 to 5 year or so type of lifespan. Then you can look at private institutions, like these Lululand, and quite a few of them popping up now. We're trying to catering for businesses in different phases of their life, and these ones are they're quite appealing for any type of entrepreneur. You just got to understand the interest rates, the repayment periods, and what the terms of the lending is. And then on there, if you're looking at private equity, if you're a much bigger business, then probably look at private equity and look at getting an investor and a partner for the long term to scale the business significantly from where you are.
Royston, what we're seeing especially within the creative space or the fashion SME space, is that creatives love making pretty stuff, and they love making product that's ready to go to the market. But we often don't see or realize the importance of simple things like your bookkeeping and your record keeping. Let's briefly touch on simple or basic tools and also the importance of bookkeeping and record keeping for SMEs.
So, the finance is obviously a critical part of the business, and it's probably the most important part. I think, for me personally, I think many business owners only really understand finance or want to understand finance when they're in a bit of a situation.
Yeah.
And sometimes by that time is possibly late. So, what I would do is what I find, if we deal with clients and they typically are more sales driven or more creative and not necessarily finance driven, we try to say, just understand the basics and let someone else do what is better, who can do it better than you,
Yeah.
It's a very important part of eventually growing a business, become a larger business, and you becoming the driver, CEO, founder of that business. You need to delegate. It's very, very important. Eventually you'll get to that point where you have to delegate, and if you're comfortable at delegating, your business can't scale at the end of the day. So if you can adapt that quite early, if you're not good at finance, potentially look at you outsourcing to a bookkeeper, or potentially doing online software. There's many out there, like Xero, for example. We generally use mostly Xero, and it's not expensive. You get quite cost-effective packages as well, and that can be managed day to day. And the benefit of those packages are that you can have an online snapshot of the business at any one time. Like this morning, I went on Xero and I could see sales already for the morning, and where we are at. And that's what the entrepreneur needs. They need on-demand information.
Yeah.
And process of doing that, those reports might not be that easy, and you might need to undergo some training sessions and some learning. But the value add from the business point of view is significant. And so understand, you need to understand the numbers as your business grows. It's not just about marketing, and it's not just about how good your product is and how perfect you want to make it. At the end of the day, to scale business to be something long term, you need to understand the finance part. So it's better to adopt that process quite early than much later.
Let's talk to two groups. The SME owner that's taken a huge knock, as a result of the current state of the economy, and they are this close to having to close shop. What are simple ways that they can restructure their finances to not have to close shop and kind of just shift finances around in order to spend where it's important?
So I mean, if I look at the biggest overheads in a typical, it would always be generally your rentals, your buildings, if you have offices. It would be salaries, and if you're buying products, your suppliers, obviously. So I think those three key areas, you obviously have to look at your survival of the business. You can't operate without those three areas. So communication is key across all those platforms, whether it's the landlord, whether it's your key supplier, whether it's your key manager, and look at what type of arrangements could be made, maybe deferred payments on the rental, deferred payments with suppliers as well, or reduced prices, or taking on consignment. And with your key managers, maybe incentivize at more incentivized future incentives rather than current cash flow that needs to be paid now. You need to be completely innovative with all these methods in terms of making sure that you can bank your money earlier, and you can as well expand in that process with the profit that you are making now. So it really boils down to how creative you as the entrepreneur can be in these.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, what has been the biggest piece of advice that you've received as a businessman? And what is the biggest piece of advice that you're sharing with our SME owners here in the country?
I would say, there's quite a few I've got, because I've got a lot of mentors around me. I would say I'm going to maybe just give you two. So I would say number one is the process of time. So you've got to understand that to build a business does take time. And you could be the most skilled entrepreneur or have the most amount of money at capital level. But the process of building, does take time. So you got to let that flow and don't be too hard on yourself through that process. I think that it will happen. It just happens at different times. Sometimes sooner, sometimes later, but it does happen. So that for me is very critical. I think I'll just leave it at that point now that I think of it. So I think that's probably it's a very personal one as well as emotive one, but it's also understanding where you are in your business as well.
Absolutely. And then lastly, what are your final tips on effective ways or effective cash flow management systems or practices for SME owners?
So definitely implement a system around budgeting and monitoring. So cash flows must be monitored up to monthly cash flows and then annual cash flows. So definitely have a control around those, and then evaluate yourself basically at either term, whether it's monthly or quarterly or annually, in terms of where you are, in terms of your set goals, and in terms of your vision, your strategic vision as well, and bring that down to the numbers. An important part also in business is looking at your working capital cycle for SMEs. They don't really understand that working capital will ultimately cause your business to fail. So you look at your debtors days, look at your creditors days, look at what can be changed there from early settlement discounts or what negotiations can happen around those. So if I just had to look at the areas for cash flow management, probably those are the most critical for SMEs at the moment.
Absolutely. Now, small businesses can survive a cash flow crunch, but one wrong move could sink them. A well-crafted plan of action to get through tough times is a necessity. To wrap this up, as Mr. Benjamin says, budgeting is of utmost importance. Develop habits that or better spending habits that's going to help you do better in business, and find online solutions like Zero, for example, which are simple, free software tools that you can use to effectively manage your cash flow. Now, it is a CEO of CHCA, Royston Benjamin. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this afternoon, Royston.
Okay. Thank you, Colin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Now, we will share information or links to CHCA in this video. And then for more exciting and informative episodes like this, brought to you by the Cape Town Fashion Council, visit ctfcdigital.co.za. I'm your host, Colin Donsko. And until next time, take care and God bless.